Hejsa. The other day I had this random idea that I would make this tiny little log cabin block, and then I turned it into a brooch. And I was thinking this would actually be a cute little present for a quilter. So I thought I would show you how I made it. Not that there's anything difficult or mysterious about making a tiny log cabin. You just have to use thin strips, really. So I've cut out some bits, and I just used whatever scraps were on my work table and cut out these strips. And the strips are 3/4 of an inch wide, and then however long I could make them. So these red and pink ones are quite short. The green ones are, well, these ones are a little bit longer. So there should be enough to make something of a similar size to this. Obviously you can make the block as big as you want, but I think this sort of size, I haven't actually measured it, but around 2 inches maybe. 2¼ inch by just over 2 inches. I think that's a good size. It's not too big, but you can still see what it's supposed to be, if you know what it is, obviously. Right, so I'll take all this over to the sewing machine and show you how I put it together. Obviously, if you made a log cabin block before, none of this should be a surprise. It would just be tiny. Right, I'll see you at the sewing machine. So I've set up my sewing machine so that it sews with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've got my strips of fabric ready, and I'm going to start with a red square, because that's a traditional color you use in the center of the log cabin, so why not go with that? I'm going to start with this lighter pink. I suppose I could start with the green ones, but I think I want to start with the pink one. So I hope you can see this properly. I can't really get any better lighting on this, but I've got the red square on the pink strip, and I'm going to sew it together so that the pink strip sticks out a little bit. And I'm not doing any back stitching, I'm just gonna sew straight across it. And then I'm going to cut off that bit of excess. And then I'm also going to cut off the other excess. But I am gonna leave a little bit Let's see if we can focus on this. There we go. I don't know if you can see, there's a tiny little excess there. It's just so that the stitching has something to hold on to outside the red square. Actually, I should probably change the stitch length because these seams are so short. Alright, and on to the next. So I'm just pressing the seam to the outside. I'm not going to bother with getting the iron out to do this. So now I put my 2 bits on top of the pink strip, and again a little bit of overhang, and it's quite easy to get this a little bit wonky. I don't know if you can see this, but my first seam is a little bit wonky, but never mind. I would suggest sewing slowly so that it's easier to control, since these are such tiny pieces. Again, cutting off the excess and cutting off on the other side. And that leaves me with this. And then I just finger press the seam, and again pressing it outward. Right, so now I need the next color, and that's going to be a green, and I think we'll go with this one. So the way that I sew the log cabins, maybe you do it differently, is that I'm always adding the next one on the left side of where I've just come. So I started by adding this one to the left of the red center, and then turn it around, added the next one to the left of what I had already done, and now I'm going to turn it again and add the green strip on the left side, and again a little bit of excess. And I can see that my square is a little bit wonky, so as I'm sewing it, I'm gonna try and hold it in place just to adjust it a little bit. But as I said, if it's wonky, I don't really mind. Pressing the seam open or to one side, and then I'm going to use the same color again, and again adding it on the left side. Right, so now it's starting to look like a log cabin. And now that the seams are getting a little bit longer, I'm going to use a fancy pressing tool, which is just a, I don't know what you call it, the foot of a, or a holder from a bobbin of yarn. Just going to use that to press the seam. It works really well, especially for small things like this. Obviously, if you're doing full size quilt blocks, it would be better to iron it or press it. Alright, so now I'm gonna pick my next red or pink color. I think I want to go with this one. And I'm adding it on the left of where I've just added one. And this is also handily the one that has only, or the only one that has 2 seams. The other sides have 1 seam or no seam. And I'm gonna add the same color. Obviously you want to make sure that if you want to use pairs like this, that you have enough of each color. Right, so my mini log cabin is starting to take shape, but I think you get the idea of how to work it now. So I'm gonna finish this and then I'll show you how to put the whole thing together to make the brooch. So I'll be back when this is at least a little bit bigger. Here's my finished log cabin block. The next step is to add some wadding to it. And I've cut 2 pieces that are about 1/2 inch smaller than my patchwork, but I think I want to just trim it down a little bit because I don't really want this to be in the seam allowance when I sew the whole thing together. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that's better. Right, so I'm going to center this. I'm going to sew it to the front. You could add a little bit of fabric here if you wanted to. Also, that would mean less fluff in your machine, but I'm just gonna do it like this. So I'm just gonna decide how I want to sew it. I think I will just start from the center and sew it like a spiral. On this last row, want to do it fairly close to this seam here, because if it's too far to the edge then it will be gobbled up by the seam allowance when I sew the whole thing together. On the last edge here I just sewed to the edge, and then the thread will be caught when I sew the whole thing together. No need to backstitch there. I did backstitch in the center. Alright, let's just remove this thread. So that's what the back looks like, and the front. So now I need my backing fabric, and I've cut a square that is just slightly bigger than my log cabin. So I'm gonna sew them together, right sides together. Obviously my backing fabric is a solid color, so it doesn't really matter. So I'm gonna sew them together, leaving a turning gap along the edge where there's no seam. So all the other ones have got a seam on them. So in this case it's this green piece. First back stitch, and then I can start sewing. So here you can, on the backing fabric, you can see where I did the seam ends for the open or the turning gap. It's about 1/2 inch along the fabric. I want to make sure that I have enough room so I can turn it inside out. So let's just cut off the threads, and this is very important, to cut off the corners so they won't be bulky when you turn it. And be careful not to cut across your seam. I almost did that there. And then just take a look, see if there's any extra bulk you can remove. Maybe I can cut off a little bit of this extra. And then you turn it inside out. Which can be a little bit tricky because it is so tiny. You want to try and poke out the corners so that the corners are as sharp as possible, but be careful not to poke through the seam or the fabric. especially if you're using a pair of scissors. Alright, I think that's as good as it's gonna get. And now the rest is hand sewing, so we'll move back to the other table. The next step is to sew the turning gap together. And it can sometimes be a bit fiddly to get this to line up properly. So I insert my needle from below the crease in the fabric inside the bit that I have already sewn on the machine. And then I come over on the other side, make a small stitch that is inside the seam, and come over to the green side, the front, and do the same. Make a tiny stitch where the needle passes on the underside of the fabric, and then insert the needle back again on the back or the opposite side. Keep going back and forth with small stitches, only about, oh, Blake is on the move. I think we're just gonna take a little break while Blake goes into the garden. Right, so now that Blake has been in the garden, I think we can carry on. Although I have left the garden door open, which may have been a mistake because he might soon find something to bark at. Anyway. So just keep on making these ladder stitches all the way across. You don't want to space them too far apart. Maybe about 2 to 3 millimeters. Something like that. Because you want to make sure that the gap is closed neatly. You don't want weird gaps, but you also don't want, so I do pull the thread tight, but I also flatten it out because I don't want it to be puckering like this. Nice and flat. And I carry on with a couple of stitches past the point where it was also machine sewed. Right, so that's it. So I'm not going to tighten off or tie off my thread now. Instead, I'm going to, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, pass it down between the two pieces of fabric and then come up on the back. I suppose I could do it on the front actually, that might be easier. Come out on the front in the corner between two logs, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch where the longest part of the stitching would be on the front and in the ditch, so that hopefully it won't be very visible. But even if it is visible, that's fine. So on the front I do the stitches about 4 millimeters long, and on the back maybe a couple of millimeters. Because although I did quilt the front to the wadding, I also want to quilt it to the back. It also makes it more flat, because if I don't, then it sort of can pull apart. And now I have quilted it all the way from the outside to the center. And because I've got quite a long thread, I'm just going to do a couple of small stitches over each other in the center here. But I'm not going to cut the thread. So now I'm going to decide, where do I want to put my brooch pin? So I'm just going to see, I think red needs to be at the top. So it's easiest to do this if you open the brooch pin. And if you haven't got one of these, I guess you could just use a safety pin. Right, so now from where I am with my thread, I'm just going to pass the needle under the fabric so I don't have a big long stitch on the back. Oh. I want to come up in that center hole if I can. There we go. There's not really any specific way to sew this on. I just sort of do whatever feels easiest, just making sure that I catch all the holes at least twice, and preferably more. And since I've got still quite a lot of thread, I'm going to do it quite a few times. Now, if you don't like it looking messy on the back, you could cover it maybe with a piece of felt or a piece of fabric. I think that's nice and secure. I'm just gonna do one more so that I come out from the middle. And actually I think I'm gonna go over the top and under the brooch pin. and then make a little stitch, pass the needle and thread through the loop, and just do that a few times so that I have the thread nice and secured. I think that's okay. Again, if this sort of thing bothers you, just cover it with something. Right, so that is the brooch pin done. I think that turned out quite cute. So which style do you prefer? The one with just 2 colors, or the one with more than one, or rather more than one print? Or more than 2 prints? Yeah, 2 prints here and multiple prints here. For some reason, no, I was gonna say this one is smaller, but yes, it is. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So how come this one is smaller? That's very strange. Anyway, I think I might send this one to a friend of mine, but this one's for me. I really like these colors and prints together. So leave a comment if you make one of these brooches, or if you've made something like this before. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please give it a like if you did. And I hope you have a great day and happy stitching.